In this section, we'll look at how the president at the end of World War II, Harry S. Truman, adopted certain assumptions that guided his Cold War policy. After FDR's death on April 12, 1945, Harry Truman became president but lacked Roosevelt's more diplomatic personality. He's the type of guy that more likely to wear his emotions on his sleeve. FDR and Stalin had their differences, but at least they put forth a facade of cooperation and gentility. When Truman met Stalin for the first time at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the anger between the two leaders was much more obvious. Facing the new Cold War, Truman also faced a debate within his administration. Some suggested the Soviets were truly motivated by their Leninist ideology. They would not act in their own country's interest, but rather would always push to spread the communist revolution one country at a time. As such, they were a true malignant threat to the United States. Others, however, argued that the Leninist ideology was only a cover, a justification for traditional dictatorial rule. The reason the Soviets took over the Eastern European countries they liberated from the Nazis was and didn't allow free elections was because they weren't trying to spread revolution, but rather to create a buffer zone between themselves and the West. And after all, over the centuries, the West had frequently invaded Russia, from the Teutonic Knights to Napoleon to the Germans into both world wars. The Soviet Union took over the Eastern European countries not to spread revolution, but to protect itself from future attacks. Now, in this view, the Soviet Union operated in its own national interest and was therefore less of a threat to the United States. Adherents of this view have argued that the Cold War in part grew from two distinct visions of the post-war world. The Soviets wanted to ensure its own interests through controlling a sphere of influence. The United States, by contrast, sought a more universal security, a collective security originally outlined in such plans as the 14 Points and the pre-World War II Atlantic Charter. The nations should work together in such organizations as the United Nations, the United States believed. Debate over Soviet motives and the appropriate American reaction raged within the Truman administration. Some advisors, such as America's ambassador to Moscow, Avro Harriman, advocated a get tough policy. Harriman called Soviet policies in Eastern Europe, quote, a barbarian invasion, and argued that the Soviets were ready to pounce on any side of weakness. Now, at the time, a debate was in the government over whether to contest the creation of a Soviet-backed communist government in Poland, or whether we should push a more democratic Polish government in exile in England. Giving up on the Western-backed government of Poland, Harriman argued, would be interpreted by the Soviets as a sign of weakness. Now, other high-ranking officials, however, advised more caution. They disagreed. Two hardline policies could trigger a horrific war unnecessarily, they argued. General George Marshall and Secretary of War Henry Stimson advised strength, but coupled with more pragmatic diplomacy. Now, Truman, knowledgeable that only the U.S. had the bomb and angered with Stalin personally, listened to both sides, but clearly favored the get-tough approach. In fact, in a meeting with Soviet Ambassador Molotov, Truman was curt and dismissive. I haven't been talked to like that in my life, Molotov stated. Truman responded, well, live up to your agreements and you won't get talked to like that again. Entering the debate was George F. Kennan. Kennan had been stationed in Moscow for the Department of State since the early 1930s. He spoke Russian, knew the culture, and was thus on the policy planning staff at the State Department. He later briefly served as American ambassador to the Soviet Union after Harriman had left. In February 1946, Kennan sent to the State Department an 8,000-word secret telegram that became famous as the, quote, long telegram. In it, Kennan argued that the Soviets were not a traditional world power. They believed in their Leninist ideology, which was added to their ancient Russian values that emphasized strength and power and de-emphasized compacts and compromises. This, in short, meant that the Soviets would always push the limits of Soviet power. Their policies had little relation to what the West did or didn't do diplomatically. They posed an intrinsic threat to the United States. Quote, no rational persuasion or assurance, Kennan wrote, would influence the Soviets. When the long telegram's conclusion spread, Kennan quickly went from a relatively obscure diplomat to a valued advisor to Truman, reinforcing Truman's natural instinct to adopt a hard line. With the idea that the Soviets were not a traditional world power, but rather an ideological and perpetual foe impervious to everything but force, sort of gaining strength in the White House, the question of exactly what the United States should do grew. Once again, Kennan had a say. After writing a report on American strategy for the Secretary of Defense James Forrestal in January 1947, Kennan received permission to publish it as an article, but he had to do so anonymously. When Kennan did so in the journal Foreign Affairs, the article entitled officially the Sources of Soviet Conduct, it became famous as the, quote, Mr. X article. In short, the Mr. X article stated, it was the American role to contain the Soviets. As Kennan later fleshed out the specifics, Kennan argued that the U.S. should define areas vital to American interest, perhaps areas rich in natural resources or having important markets, those countries with some strategic value, whatever, and they should be prepared to contain the Soviets from spreading there perpetually. The main element of any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Soviet expansionist tendencies, the Mr. X article read. Kennan didn't believe the United States had the ability to contain the Soviets everywhere. Some areas not of any value were not worth American blood and money. But in defending those that were, the U.S. should be prepared to use all of its might, military, economic, and diplomatic. Only by mastering all of these forces, military, economic, and diplomatic, could the American forces, ultimately contain the Soviets. The Mr. X article was historic in that it defined the basic policy of America throughout all the Cold War. That policy, of course, was containment. Over the years, just how and when the U.S. contained the Soviets would change. The containment policy would evolve, in short. But its basic tenets, just defining America's policy of containing the Soviets, that stayed until the Soviets' demise in 1991. This concludes the section on some of the assumptions that Truman developed right at the end of World War II.